Thanks, Kyle. Good morning. Good to be here with you again. We're going to come to the time in our service where we'll look at a passage of Scripture and talk about what it means for our lives today. So if you have a Bible, I'd ask you to turn to the letter of 1 Peter, chapter 2. If you're using this brown pew Bible in front of you, if you don't have one, it's on page 858. 858 in the brown pew Bible. And when you found that, would you stand with me and I'd like to read together this passage that we'll be looking at this morning. 1 Peter chapter 2, and we'll start at verse 13. First Peter chapter 2, 13. Peter writes this: "Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every authority instituted among men, whether to the king as the supreme authority, or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish men. Live as free men, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as servants of God. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the brotherhood of believers. Fear God. Honor the king." This is God's word. You may be seated. Pray for us now as we begin this section of our service. Living God, we would ask now that you would open up our hearts and ears as we come to this time to look at your word, that you would cause us to be those who are not only hearers of the word but doers of it, that this would be a time when you would change and transform us by this word to be different than when we came in. We would grow in our understanding of you and in our love for you. It would change the way we live today. You've said in your word that when you send out this word, it accomplishes the purpose for which you sent it. God, accomplish that purpose in each of us today. And as I always ask, living God, would you move and govern my tongue to speak your truth now? Amen. In 1984, Cynthia Wissell and her colleagues from Laurentian University published the Dictionary of Affect in Language. A dictionary of affect in language. Now, affect, not effect. We often confuse those two words. They are different. Affect, as Merriam-Webster dictionary defines it, is to act upon as a person or a person's mind or feelings so as to produce a response. That's what affect is, as opposed to effect, which is usually the response. And the whole point of this dictionary was to publish the results of testing they had done on over 4,500 English words as to their emotional affect, or how it is that they are emotionally and visually stimulating of certain words over and above others. That was the whole point of their research, and what they discovered was all kinds of things. For example, that to speak of, let's say, an athlete who is covered in sweat, that doesn't always necessarily going to produce the same visual images in our mind as if we were to talk about an athlete who is dripping in sweat. It just touches us differently in our minds, just using a different word. Or for those of you who are Vancouver Canucks fans, if we talk about rival hockey teams that we face, that doesn't produce the same amount of emotional affect in us as if we were to mention a specific team like the Boston Bruins. That has very particular emotions attached to it, images that come to mind right away. I mention all that for the simple fact that the word that we're looking at today from this letter that Peter writes, submission, obedience, putting yourself intentionally underneath someone else's rule and authority, that word carries all kinds of emotional and visual affect for all of us, doesn't it? Most times, those images and those emotions are negative. I mean, if we think about in a context, let's say like wrestling or MMA, you think about being in a rear naked choke, and they talk about, okay, submitting there, your only choice is you're either going to submit and tap out, or you're going to be lights out. Or, let's say maybe we think of submission, and immediately we think of countries where women are abusively oppressed and caused to submit in abusive or emotionally damaging ways. It comes up to our mind when we hear that word. The point is, wherever we live, whether we lived in Peter's day or living in our day today, we very often associate the word submission with a loss of power and restricted personal freedom. And that's going to mean a lot, particularly for us in our own day and age, right? We're living in a Western, affluent, first world country where just our culture in general, that doesn't jive at all with them, does it? I mean, we live in a culture where people don't like to hear the word no. They don't like to hear the words you can't or you need to be obedient to that. We don't like to go down that road. And that's going to be a hurdle that we'll need to overcome this morning. Because Peter in our passage, he's going to tell us that we need to be submitting to all kinds of different people. And many times, it's almost in every case, it's going to be submitting to people who we don't necessarily trust, people who we feel may or may not have our best interests in mind. And in Peter's words, when we read it at first glance, they seem just wrong. They seem counterintuitive to us. And if we can't get beyond that initial first impression, we're going to completely miss what it is that Peter wants to say to us this morning in this passage. That submission, at least in the way that Peter's describing it, submission is the only path for true freedom as exiles. It's the only path for true freedom. We're continuing in a series this morning that we've entitled Elect Exiles, walking through the book of 1 Peter, not verse by verse, but touching on different sections. And I think Kyle last week talked, his explanation of those two things and how they work together was excellent. Talking about how the fact that as Christians we are elect. We are God's chosen people, which means we have acceptance, we have a home. And yet at the same time, we are living in a world that seeks to live in complete rejection of or in opposition to God. And so as those elect people, those chosen people, we're now also exiles. We are rejected. We are pushed out by our culture and world. And one of the whole things we're looking at in this whole book of 1 Peter is how it is that God expects us to live out those two realities at the same time. Chosen and yet also exiled at the same time. Last week we talked about one of the ways that we can live out those two realities by living with holy conduct. This morning I want to talk to you about how we can live out those two realities by being submissive. And we're going to look at that from this passage. I want to look at it in three ways this morning. Very simply, we'll talk about the who of submission, the why of submission, and finally the how of submission. Just those three things. Who is it that we're supposed to be submitting to? Why on earth would we want to do that? And finally, how can we do that? Just those three things, okay? So if you closed your Bibles, please open them up again to 1 Peter. I want you to look at this with me, starting at chapter 2 and verse 13, and we'll dig into this together. Okay, so let's begin by looking at the who of submission. Who should we be submitting to? Well, Peter begins in verse 13 and 14 here by giving us a listing of some of the people that we're supposed to be submitting to in this life. I'm going to actually read a little bit beyond that passage and even into a little bit in chapter 3 because Peter's going to highlight a number of different areas where he says we're supposed to be submitting, and I think that gives us a broader picture of what we're talking about this morning. So first of all, look with me in verse 13 and 14. Peter writes here, "Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every authority instituted among men, whether to the king as the supreme authority, or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong, commend those who do right." Okay, so Peter's saying we need to submit to every authority instituted among men, which in Peter's context is going to be the emperor. Peter's submitting to the emperor. He's telling these people who are exiles in the Roman Empire to submit to this empire, and also to governors, those who would be sent out by him to rule over and reign in the different regions of Rome. But then look now just below our passage in verse 18. Look what Peter says here now. "Slaves, submit yourselves to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh." And then finally, skip just up ahead to chapter 3, the big black number 3 there in verse 1. Look what Peter says here. "Wives, in the same way, be submissive to your husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives when they see the purity and reverence of your lives." Okay, wow. In my Bible, that's one page, and in one page we've got government, slavery, and male headship in marriage. Okay? It's going to be a fun morning, right? Thank you. Would you be patient with me? Honestly, Each one of those subjects is so big that there's no way that we're going to be able to adequately dig into all of them. To be very honest with you, I'm going to speak in submission to authority more broadly this morning. But I think that's important to see that. And in order to even move even a step further, I know some of you are already like, no, we've gone too far. So I need to just say quickly a few things so that we can keep moving ahead. First of all, when Peter is talking about this submission of slaves to their masters, very first thing I need you to hear, Peter is not, this is not the Bible's condoning of slavery. I don't know if you've ever heard this, oh yeah, the Bible condones slavery. That's not what's happening here. If anything, Peter is much more referring to how it is that we might submit to a boss at work than submitting to some slave master with a whip in his hand. That's what he's referring to, submission to a boss, someone you work for. And also, when it comes to submission in marriage, Peter is not referring to marital situations where the physical and emotional safety of a wife and her children is in danger. Okay, the Bible has very, very different things to say about both of those things and against both of those things, slavery and abuse in marriage. Okay, and I need you to hear me say that. I need you to be on the same page as me, because if you don't, we're not going to be able to even go another step here. Okay, so we're not talking about people who've been stolen from their country and forced to work somewhere else. We're not talking about submitting to abuse in marriage. Are we good? Can we move on? Okay. Okay, so he lists these three broad areas: government, work, marriage. These areas that we are to be submissive. Now, of those three areas, government, work, marriage, where do you see the most likely way that we would see ourselves as Christians living as exiles? Where do you think that would be? Just call it out. What's it for you? Where do we see ourselves most easily as exiles? Okay, for me, I'm going to say government. Government in general, it's kind of a broad who is governing the land, and also I may include the culture that we live in there, right? Okay, because as the tide of public opinion shifts, so too often do the laws that govern the land. And so more and more, we can easily see ourselves being rejected and exiled by our culture as we continue to try to hold fast and stay steady to what the Bible is saying, even as the culture shifts away from it. But how about your job? Can you be an exile in your job? Yeah, I see heads nodding. And have any of you ever been the only Christian in your workplace? There we go. Any of you have been the only Christian in your classroom? Or maybe in your university dorm room? Peter's saying here, submit to every authority instituted among men. Ever been the only Christian in that scenario? When the after work or after class activities, or even the at-work and in-class conversation and or the media consumption that's going on goes against what you believe in your values as a Christian, you probably already know it's only going to be a matter of time before you begin to be singled out, because you know you're the person who's not going along with what everyone else is doing, and you begin to be exiled by those people. How about in marriage? Can you be an exile in your own marriage? If you talk to anybody right now who is married to an unbelieving spouse, they'll tell you absolutely you can. You could absolutely be an exile even within your own marriage. And as just a small parenthesis here, that it's one of the reasons. I mean, listen, for those of you who are here today who are in dating relationships, looking ahead to marriage, it's one of the reasons that the Bible is going to instruct us, and we would want to just plead with you to not join yourself in marriage with someone who doesn't share the most important thing in your life, your faith in Jesus Christ. There's a lot of really neat people out there, great people out there, cute boys and pretty girls who can have great relationships with, but I'll tell you, you're setting yourself up for years, decades of untold heartache and struggle if you join yourself in marriage with someone who doesn't share your faith. Because faith and the gospel are not things that we can contain in this Sunday morning experience. You can't, because they were never designed to be that way. They necessarily affect every area of our lives. And as they do that, we're just going to come into conflict after conflict after conflict with someone who doesn't share the same belief in those things. Okay, so end of parenthesis. We can be exiles in all of those areas. All of those areas. in our culture, in our workplace, in our marriages. So we think about that. Peter's telling us here, be submissive to the governing authorities, to your bosses, to professors and teachers, to husbands. That's who Peter's telling us to be submissive to. And although there's a lot of things we could say, for this first point, I just want to highlight something which is really critical for us to see. Look at what Peter says in verses 13 and 14 here. Just quickly look through those verses. Tell me if you see anywhere where Peter includes any kind of qualifier or exceptions to the rule when it comes to submitting to the governing authorities. Do you see that? Where he says it's okay to not submit to the government if it's not the party you voted for. Is that in here? Okay, what about in verse 18? Do you see somewhere where Peter says we should submit to bosses, who are fair and run their businesses well and ethically like we would want them to? Do you see that in here? Or in chapter 3, verse 1, somewhere where Peter tells wives, submit to your husbands, as long as they're not an idiot who couldn't lead their way out of a paper bag. Then, you don't need to. No. And because we've talked about this, each one of us, we hear the word submission, and we've all got that inner defense attorney that just wants to put up his hand and be like, wait, objection. I don't know what I'm objecting to, but I'm going to be looking here for some sort of exception to the rule that means I don't have to do this anymore. And it's not here. I mean, Peter even expands on some of these instructions. I mean, that's why in verse 18 he includes wicked bosses. He says, not just to the ones who are good, but also to wicked, harsh bosses. Submit to them. Chapter 3, verse 1, he includes unbelieving spouses. He's trying to anticipate everywhere where you're going to come in and say, well, what about? And he's just going to say, no. I mean, maybe you'd even want to try to argue with Peter and say, dude, listen, you don't know who just became the Prime Minister of Canada. Well, okay. Maybe Justin is not the Jesus-loving, marijuana-hating, unborn life-loving Prime Minister we'd wanted to be. Maybe not. But if you were here last week or you just know historically who the governing authority that's over Peter and the people that he's writing to here, the Emperor Nero, under whose rule and reign Peter is going to be executed. The Emperor Nero, who has some of the bloodiest hands in human history when it comes to persecution of Christians. That's who Peter's submitting to. So, I mean, Peter's probably going to look at Justin Trudeau and be like, please, you don't even know how good you have it. What we need to see here is that the Bible is just stripping away every excuse that we might want to bring and come up with for not being obedient to this command, not submitting to ourselves as these elect exiles. He does that by not giving us any qualifications and also by seeking to just intercept any potential objections. The Bible's command is not if this, that, or the other thing, then be submissive to governing authorities. No, the Bible's command is just submit. Submit to them. The only question we need to answer for ourselves is, are we going to be obedient to that command? And let's be honest. Let's be honest. I know it's church, but let's be honest with each other this morning and say, that's hard to do. That's really hard to do, and to hear and be obedient to that because there's no qualifications, there's no provisos, there's no wiggle room to get out. I mean, it feels like we're standing in front of a steep mountain with lots of different paths going up and being told, no, you got to go up the straight, the most difficult and dangerous one. And so, in order to be sufficiently motivated to actually follow and be obedient to that command, we're going to want to know pretty quickly, why should I? Why would I want to be submissive? That's going to lead us to our next point now, the why of submission. Why should we be submissive? What's the point of this submissive living that Peter's talking about? What rationale does he offer? Well, I think Peter actually gives us 3 reasons here for living in submission as elect exiles. 3 reasons. The first one, it's actually only found kind of implicitly in the text, and then it's fleshed out elsewhere, but let's look at it first. Look at verse 13 with me. Peter says here, I think very intentionally, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every authority instituted among men. Instituted. Okay, so we're to be submissive, obedient to this authority that's been instituted among men, and then he's listing all these different types of authority. Maybe the question you're asking yourself is, instituted by who? Who has set these things in place? Well, it's only alluded to here, it's only implied, but it's fleshed out in much greater detail in Paul's letter to the church at Rome, who was in very similar situations to the people Peter's writing here. You don't have to turn there, but if you'd like to see in Romans chapter 13, verse 1, it's on page 804 of this Pew Bible. Listen to what Paul says to people here regarding the governing authorities that have been set up. Romans 13, verse 1, Paul writes, "Everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities." Why? "For there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently," verse 2, "he who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted. And those who do so will bring judgment on themselves." Okay. So what we see here is that the first reason that we are to live lives of submission to these different authorities is because they have been instituted by God himself. He's the one who set it up. And Paul actually, as you see, he goes so far as to say, if we're not living in submission to these governing authorities, not only are we going against God's good design for these governing authorities, which is to set up a social environment where there's order, societal order, and human flourishing, we are also going against God himself if we don't live these submissive lives. So that's the first reason. God himself has set up these authorities that Peter's telling us we need to be submissive to. Second reason Peter offers of why we should live submissive lives as these elect exiles is found in verse 15. Verse 15, look with me there. Peter writes, "For it's God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish men." Okay, so what we have Peter talking about now is removing opportunities for slander of Christians and of the Christian faith. Okay? Now, most commentators agree here that when he says, by doing good, you'll silence the ignorant talk of foolish men, he's referring to what he just said in verse 13 and 14 about living lives of submission. So that's how we silence the ignorant talk of foolish men. And let's be honest, okay? There's been a lot of dumb things said about Christians throughout the years. Some of them we've absolutely straight up earned, but a lot of them, they come about because of misinformation. They come about because maybe even people are intentionally trying to discredit Christians or the Christian faith. I mean, maybe you know that in the early church, the church was accused of practicing cannibalism because when they took the Lord's Supper, they talked about eating the flesh of their leader and drinking his blood. And so they said, man, we got to shut down these Christians. They're practicing cannibalism. Or, in our own day and age, one of the common things that's brought against Christians in the Christian church is, oh, you're Christians? Oh, you're those people that hate all gay and lesbian people. That's what you do. And you know what? That's actually a charge that's come against us that to some degree we've earned. We've earned because of the way that we have treated and responded to the gay community over the years, and we need to be diligent in continuing to work to demonstrate that that's not the case, that as children of God, we do not hate our gay and lesbian neighbors. But Peter's second point here is that living lives of submission to the authorities that God has put in place, that is one way that we can demonstrate that unfounded, slanderous accusations that are brought against Christians are not true. That's one way that we do it. Now let's apply that quickly to those three categories we talked about: government, work, and marriage. Let's think about how that applies. First of all, government. Wouldn't it be awesome if a lobbying group came to the government and said, listen, you know what? We are losing so much revenue right now with these special tax exemptions that churches get. Why would we do that? Those people are just a weight on our society. They're just spreading their bigotry all around, their ancient, archaic views. Let's start bringing some of that money back into the economy to help us. Wouldn't it be great if the government could say, well, of course I care about the economy, but from everything I've seen, those Christians are some of the best citizens our country has. They pay their taxes. They pay their taxes honestly. They submit to the laws of the land. They actually go above and beyond their own work to help us run this country, taking care of the needs that even we can't reach. No, that's certainly not the problem in our country. We're not touching that. Or if in work, what if someone were to come to your boss and say, actually, did you know that so-and-so is a Christian? Did you know that? You really want that kind of person working here, walking around, judging everybody for being, these sinful people, spreading their bigotry and homophobia around here? I mean, if customers find out that somebody like that works here, we're going to start losing business. Wouldn't you like your boss to be able to say, of course I care about my business, thank you, but that person you're talking about, she's actually the best employee we've got here. Customers love her. She actually, whenever I bring something to her, she goes above and beyond whatever I've asked her and helps this place to actually be doing super well. I don't see her being a Christian as a problem here at all. Or in your marriage. What if one day one of your husband's buddies out in the golf course says to you, dude, why would you let your wife go to church week after week? Why would you let her do that? She's just filling up her mind with all kinds of that religious nonsense. She's going to be trying to import all that crap into your kids. Do you really want that? I mean, dude, she's just going to start be resisting you at every single point. You really ought to cut that off. You really ought to stop that. Wouldn't you like your husband to be able to say, no, actually, you don't know what you're talking about. My wife is one of the most loving, respectful women I've ever met. She loves and serves this family day after day like no one I've ever met. She wants me to go to church. I know she does, but she never makes me feel judged or pushed out because I don't come. Now, you don't know what you're talking about. That's not a problem at all in our marriage. Living these submissive lives shuts down all of that slanderous talk that would come against the Christian faith because it doesn't stick if we're truly living lives that way. So again, God says Peter instituted these authorities and that in order to silence slander, we are also to live these submissive lives. What's the final reason is in chapter 3 and verse 1 and 2. Look again there. Peter says here, wives, in the same way be submissive to your husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives when they see the purity and reverence of their lives. Now, that's carrying over a bit from the last point that we talked about, but the reason Peter gives here that submission to these authorities that God has put in place, the reason we should be doing that is because it's a demonstration of the gospel. It's a demonstration of the gospel. Peter says here explicitly that if we live lives of submission, one of the benefits could be that some who do not yet believe may be won over to faith in Jesus. Amen. As a Christian, in our city, in our workplaces, in our families, that should always be one of the highest aims of our lives, to see those who we know and love come to the same hope that we have in the gospel. In each of these three reasons Peter presents as to why we should live these lives of submission, what I find fascinating is Peter seems to be saying that submission in particular, it almost has its own power to itself. It almost has its own transforming power. And I think one of the big reasons for that, again, particularly in our own culture here, is that personal autonomy, the rights of the individual, is pretty much the only thing that's held sacred anymore. If you just look at the advertising and TV and print ads today that set up you as the center of the universe, or even the religious zealots who are waging war at every opportunity, a submissive life, a life that submits and gives in and supports, it just stands out. It stands out. I mean, it's unique, and it draws attention to itself. And as we know, in every day and age, uniqueness is something that people notice. It's something that they even champion in our own day and age. Just look at Lady Gaga. Uniqueness is something we're like, yeah, that's right, that's cool because it's different. Something that grabs people's attention and makes them want to know more. That's no less true today. And I think that's a big part of Peter's rationale for why we should live these lives of submission as elect exiles. Because submission is utterly unique in our day and age, when everyone's looking out for number one. Submission is utterly unique. It stands out and it draws attention, which, by the way, is also one of the reasons we find it so hard to do. Because, first of all, it requires intentional effort in order to personally and intentionally put yourself underneath someone else's rule and authority. But also, if we're honest, most times we don't really want to stand out that much, do we? We're pretty much happy to just slip back and blend into the wallpaper, thank you very much, because we know what also comes from that attention. And yet, we're being commanded to stand out in this and many other ways. Jesus' own words in the Sermon on the Mount, where no one lights a lamp and puts it under a bowl, we set it up on a stand so that it may be seen. God's desire is that we might be seen in order that people might come to know Him. Okay, so we talked about the who of submission, the why of submission. The last thing I want us to see from our passage this morning is the how of submission. How in the world are we ever going to do this? How can we live in this unique way that is obedient to God, that silences slander and draws people to Jesus? How can we do that? I think Peter's answer here is at the beginning of verse 13, and it's 4 simple words. He says, the only way we're going to live submissive lives is by doing it for the Lord's sake. We do it for the Lord's sake. That's how. In other words, what Peter is saying is that when we see our lives as submitting to our ultimate ruler and authority in Jesus Christ, well then we no longer understand submission to the authorities that God has instituted in this world as submitting to them. We understand that submission as submission to Him. It's in coming to understand at last that apparent paradox I mentioned at the beginning of this message. That the kind of submission Peter is talking about here, that apparent loss of freedom, is actually the only way for any of us to truly be free. Now, before we get that, and we're reading this sounds crazy and incomprehensible. I mean, we hear, for instance, in verse 16, Peter telling Christians who are being persecuted under Roman occupation to live as free men. It just sounds crazy. It sounds like Peter has got no idea what he's talking about. That kind of just like pie in the sky, eyes closed and ears plugged kind of wishful thinking that people often accuse Christians of being, right? The only way Peter can say that is because Peter was also there when Jesus said these words in John chapter 8. If you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples. Then you will know the truth. The truth will set you free. Then he said just a few verses later, if the Son sets you free, then you are free indeed. It's only understanding that it begins to become much more clear to us how it is that Peter can say that we are to live as free men and women, even as we submit ourselves to the authority of these other people. Because you see, the Bible speaks of each one of us here this morning, all people throughout history, as slaves. As slaves. We may think we are free, autonomous people. You'd say to me, I'm not a slave of anybody. I'm not a slave of Trudeau, my boss, my husband, nobody. I'm not a slave to nobody. I'm free. Nobody can't control me. Okay? And yet, each one of us is also ruled by something. A controlling passion or desire that motivates and directs every decision you make in your life, and without which you feel like if I didn't have that thing, I wouldn't be able to go on. Think about your own life. Take a moment to consider your own life. What's that one thing that you feel like, man, if I didn't have that, if that was taken away from me, I couldn't go on another step. Whatever that thing is, that's the thing that's truly ruling your life. That's the thing that's the authority over you. And the wonderful message of the Bible is that submission to Jesus as Lord, making Him that thing which you pursue in your life and the thing that without which you feel like I wouldn't be able to go on, that kind of submission, that actually changes everything. That flips the whole script on its head. It changes our status of who we are and also our perspective on all of life. gives us a whole new way to see things. So we see now that submission to earthly authorities for the Lord's sake then is something very, very, very different. The way to think of it is, we all remember growing up as kids when mom and dad would go out for a date and they would bring in a babysitter to watch over you. Even at that age, we knew that any authority or power that that babysitter had was put in place and given to them by our parents. Submission to that babysitter, when they told us to brush our teeth, get your jammies on, go to bed, submission to them was ultimately really submission to our parents' authority. But it came through our submission to them. That's exactly what Peter's talking about here. What Peter's getting at is that coming to Jesus, seeing all of our lives as being in submission to Him, changes our perspective on what it means to live out lives of submission to the authorities that God's put in place. And yes, you really are submitting to them. It's not sort of a fake, winking submission where we're like, yeah, I'm submitting, but not really. That's why he goes on to say in verse 16, live as free men, but don't use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. That you really are to submit to these people. But that submission can now become an expression of your superior devotion and submission to God as we submit our lives in all those different ways and to all those different people for the Lord's sake. The one that we truly submit to and fear, as verse 17 says, is God. He is the highest authority. Honoring the emperor or whatever other authorities God has put in place is simply then the expression of our ultimate submission to God. Well, once all that's said and done, as it relates to the submission to these earthly authorities among men, one of the things we haven't looked at all this morning is what it might look like to not submit to them. Or when are the times when civil disobedience is appropriate? That's an important question, one that I want to touch on even just for a minute as we close here, because we got to remember that just because God is the one who has instituted these authorities doesn't mean that those authorities are going to govern and lead in ways that are consistent with the God who created them, right? So what would our response be then when the authorities that God put over us seek to lead us in ways that go against what we know God's will to be in the Bible? When is disobedience to this command that Peter's talking about appropriate for the elect exile? Well, fortunately, the Bible is filled with examples that we can refer back to and learn from when we're trying to understand what we do when the governing authorities that God has put in place try to lead us in ways that go against God. I'm going to list just a few of them here, but there are many others we could list. First of all, in Exodus chapter 1, the Hebrew midwives do not submit to Pharaoh's command of gendercide, to put to death all the male Hebrew babies, but allow the female ones to live. They don't submit to his command. In Daniel chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego do not submit to Nebuchadnezzar's command that they must bow down and worship the golden statue. In Daniel 6, Daniel does not submit to King Darius' edict that they are to pray to no one but him. All through the New Testament, we see the disciples not submitting to the commands of the religious rulers, not to preach in any name, but to preach in Jesus' name. They command them not to do that. They don't submit to their commands. In each one of those cases, and many other we could bring up, civil disobedience, the criteria for it, it goes back to what we said in our last point. Understanding our submission to the authorities instituted by God through the lens of God as our ultimate authority. So that means then, in cases that I mentioned now and many other that we could bring up, when following the commands of authorities that God has put in place requires us to be in direct violation of God's revealed will, well then disobedience to those people and to those authorities isn't just suggested, it's commanded. That's the criteria. Whenever obedience to the authorities goes against God's revealed will, that's when civil disobedience is appropriate. And yes, this would also naturally extend to all these other areas that Peter spoke about in our workplace, in our marriages. Peter is not telling us to be submissive for the Lord's sake to a boss who would ask us to adjust the ledger just a little bit so that it looks like our company made more profits this year than it actually did. Peter is not telling us to submit for the Lord's sake to a husband who would seek to lead us in ways that would include a physical or sexual abuse. All of those things we know, those actions, those deeds go against God's revealed will and His Word, and so we are not to submit to them. Maybe that sounds obvious. Maybe you'd say, yeah, of course we wouldn't. But here's the hard thing. The difficult thing is we come to understand what that looks like, because in each one of those cases, God does not grant diplomatic immunity to us when we are submissive to Him and disobey those earthly authorities. He doesn't do it. In each one of those cases that I brought up, and pretty much any others that I could bring up, there were direct consequences suffered for that civil disobedience. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were chucked into the fiery furnace because they wouldn't submit to the king's command. Daniel was thrown into the lion's den because he wouldn't submit to Darius. Disciples and the apostles, they were put in prison. They were beaten and whipped for not submitting to what the religious rulers were telling them to stop doing. And it's going to be the same way for you and I today. There will come a time when we will face prison for not following what the authorities put in place. There may be times we would lose our jobs because of that. There may be time we would suffer further abuse from angry spouses when we refuse to submit to their authority and submit instead to God's revealed will. All that the Bible promises, and I say all in quotation marks because that all is everything. But all the Bible promises us in those circumstances, and what is our hope and our motivation in those places, is that what awaits us in the end for our submission to God is infinitely better than whatever is lost in the present. Whatever is lost is infinitely better than what we lose right now because of submission to God. The greatest example that we see of that is actually just beyond our passage and what Kyle's going to be preaching on next week. That it was only as Jesus Himself submitted Himself under the authority of human rulers who would arrest Him, beat Him, and put Him to death on a Roman cross. It was only as He submitted to that authority that He was able to accomplish our redemption. And the way He was able to do that, the way He endured that unjust suffering, Peter tells us in verse 23, was by continually entrusting Himself to God. Or to use the language of verse 13, He was able to submit to human authorities for the Lord's sake. It's the same way for you and I today. As we look at what Jesus endured for us, it can empower us then to live lives presently in submission to whatever authorities God has put in place over us. Author of Hebrews tells us that it was for the joy set before Him that Jesus endured the cross, enduring its shame and despising its shame. Paul tells us in Philippians that after Jesus had completed this incomprehensibly hard act of submission, that He was exalted to the highest place and given the name which is above every name. We'll be looking at that actually in the next few weeks, talking about how future hope can empower us for present action. But here, for us this morning as elect exiles, I want us to always keep in front of us, all of us, keep in front of us that unique nature of Peter's command here. To live lives of submission to the authorities that God has put in place, recognizing how the uniqueness will stand out as a bright light in this dark world. It will silence slanderous attacks against the Christian faith, and it will draw those around us, men and women, to their only hope for true freedom themselves as they submit to Jesus Christ as the Lord of their lives.